The courtroom fell into tense silence. A little black girl stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly, but her gaze was firm. The judge watched her closely, unaware that her next words would change everything. "Well, what do you want to say?" he asked, trying to remain composed. The girl took a deep breath, her voice steady but calm. What she said left everyone frozen, and the judge completely speechless. What words could have had such an effect? Share your guesses in the comments and subscribe to the channel to hear the rest of the story. The courtroom buzzed with barely contained tension, every seat occupied by spectators, reporters, and legal teams. The case had gripped the public for weeks, a prominent white businessman accused of orchestrating the illegal seizure of land from marginalized black families. The charges were serious, but his wealth and influence cast a shadow of doubt over the possibility of justice. Many feared the proceedings would be just another example of power triumphing over the powerless. The defendant sat at the long table with his high-profile legal team. His posture exuded confidence, his expensive suit and calm demeanor projecting the air of a man who believed he was untouchable. His lawyers whispered reassurances, certain they could manipulate the narrative to protect their client. Suddenly, a stir swept through the room as the prosecutor called their next witness. A hush fell over the crowd when a small black girl stepped forward. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her frame dwarfed by the imposing podium. Her simple dress and tightly braided hair stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of the courtroom. For a moment, everyone froze, uncertain what to make of her presence. The murmurs began almost immediately. "Who is she?" whispered one spectator to another. "What could a child possibly have to say in a case like this?" Some scoffed, others looked on with curiosity, while a few exchanged knowing glances, assuming this was a desperate move by the prosecution. As she climbed the small step to reach the microphone, the tension in the room deepened. Even the judge, a stern man with years of experience, leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Her small hands gripped the edge of the podium, knuckles white from the effort. Despite her nervousness, there was a quiet determination in her posture that seemed to silence the remaining whispers. The defense team exchanged amused glances, their smirks suggesting they saw her as little more than a distraction. The businessman, however, shifted in his seat, his confident facade flickering for the briefest moment. Something about her presence unsettled him, though he quickly masked his discomfort. The judge cleared his throat, his deep voice echoing through the silent room. "State your name for the record," he instructed gently, clearly trying not to intimidate the young witness. The girl took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the overwhelming presence of the crowd. "My name is Amara Johnson," she said. Her words carried a surprising strength, filling the room and commanding attention. Every eye was now on her, including those of the defendant. What could this little girl possibly know that could matter? The answer would soon become clear, and it would shake the courtroom to its core. The judge adjusted his glasses, his piercing gaze fixed on the small girl standing behind the podium. His face, lined with years of experience and hardened by countless cases, betrayed a flicker of skepticism. To him, this child seemed an unlikely witness in a trial of such magnitude. He leaned forward slightly, his robe shifting as he rested his hands on the desk before him. "Well," he began, his voice steady but tinged with impatience, "what do you have to say, young lady?" The question hung in the air, its tone calm but unmistakably laced with doubt. It was the kind of tone adults often use with children when they believe the answer will be irrelevant or unhelpful. The girl hesitated, her small fingers clutching the edge of the podium as if drawing strength from its solidity. Her eyes scanned the room briefly, landing on the defendant, whose smirk hadn't entirely faded. The sight of his smug confidence seemed to stir something within her. Straightening her shoulders, she returned her gaze to the judge. The room, filled with lawyers, reporters, and spectators, seemed to lean forward collectively. Even those who initially dismissed her presence now sensed that something significant was about to unfold. A bead of sweat trickled down the temple of the prosecutor, who watched her with a mix of hope and apprehension. The defense team, however, sat back in their chairs, their body language exuding casual dismissal. The judge's expression hardened slightly as the silence stretched on. "Take your time," he added, though his tone betrayed more of a command than a reassurance. His words were meant to encourage her, but the slight edge in his voice only emphasized his doubt. Amara took a deep breath, her small chest rising and falling with determination. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was steady but soft, forcing the room to quiet completely to hear her. "I want to tell the truth," she said simply. The simplicity of her words caused an unexpected ripple through the courtroom. For a moment, the judge's stern demeanor faltered, and he blinked, as if caught off guard. He sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk in a rare display of uncertainty. The tension was palpable. The little girl's presence, her quiet but firm resolve, seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room. No one dared to interrupt her now, not even the judge, whose earlier condescension began to give way to a flicker of curiosity. "Well, then," he said, his voice slightly softer this time, though his doubt still lingered, "let's hear it. What truth do you want to share with this court?" Amara's grip on the podium tightened, and her next words would silence the room in a way no one, especially the judge, could have anticipated. Amara inhaled deeply, steadying herself as her small hands gripped the edge of the podium. The courtroom was utterly silent, the kind of silence that buzzes with anticipation. All eyes were on her, but her gaze was locked on the judge, her young face a mix of defiance and vulnerability. Then, with a voice that was both firm and trembling, she spoke. "He said we're not human." The words struck the room like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the audience, and several spectators exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the defendant, who had maintained an air of smug confidence throughout the trial, suddenly sat rigid in his chair. His face twitched slightly, his composure cracking for the first time. The judge leaned back in his chair, visibly startled. His usually impassive face betrayed a flicker of disbelief, followed by something more serious, concern. He adjusted his glasses, as if hoping that what he just heard was a misunderstanding. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Amara lifted her chin slightly, her courage unwavering despite the weight of the moment. "He said we're not human," she repeated, louder this time, her words carrying an unshakable conviction that silenced any murmurs in the courtroom. The prosecutor's pen, which had been scribbling notes moments earlier, now lay forgotten on the desk. He stared at Amara, a mix of admiration and sadness in his eyes. The defense team, on the other hand, shuffled papers awkwardly, their earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. The weight of her words settled over the room, and it was as if the entire courtroom held its collective breath. For the first time, the abstract accusations of land theft and abuse took on a human face, a child's face, and the cruelty of the defendant's actions became impossible to ignore. The judge cleared his throat, his usual commanding tone replaced by something softer. "Are you certain those were his words?" he asked, though the question felt redundant. Everyone in the room could see the truth written across her young, earnest face. Amara nodded, her voice unwavering. "Yes. He said it to my dad, and I heard him." Her statement hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and inescapable. The audience was frozen, as if daring not to breathe, while the reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the story of a lifetime. Even those who had initially doubted her presence now saw the undeniable impact of her testimony. The defendant's lawyer finally stood, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "This is hearsay. The witness is just a child." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "Sit down, counselor," he ordered sharply. His focus returned to Amara, who stood tall despite her small frame. "You're doing well, young lady. Please, continue." The defendant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado now replaced with thinly veiled panic. He glanced at his lawyer, but the man avoided his gaze, clearly unsure how to counter the impact of Amara's words. In that moment, it became clear to everyone present, this was not just another testimony. It was a reckoning. Amara's courage had pierced through the layers of legal jargon and deflection, exposing the raw truth. And it was only the beginning. Amara gripped the edge of the podium tightly as she began her story, her small voice cutting through the heavy silence of the courtroom. It started about a year ago, she said, her gaze shifting briefly to the defendant, whose once confident smirk had turned into a rigid expression. He came to our neighborhood with his men. They told us we had to leave. The room remained eerily still, every person captivated by the brave child recounting the injustices her family and community had faced. He said the land didn't belong to us anymore. But my dad said we had the papers to prove it was ours. Her voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on, her words growing stronger. They didn't care. They laughed at my dad and said, "People like you don't deserve anything this nice." She paused, swallowing hard, her small frame trembling as the memory resurfaced. One of his men told us we were trash. He said we were lucky they weren't kicking us out that same day. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, his face a mask of grim determination, while the defense team squirmed uncomfortably. The weight of Amara's testimony was undeniable, her words painting a vivid picture of exploitation and cruelty. They told my mom she should be thankful they weren't calling the police, Amara continued, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. But we didn't do anything wrong. We just wanted to keep our home. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable but no longer skeptical. And what happened after that, Amara? He asked gently, his voice softer than before. She inhaled deeply, wiping her eyes before answering. They kept coming back. Every week, someone new would show up, telling us we had to leave. My dad tried to talk to them, but they wouldn't listen. One time, they knocked over the fence my dad built and said it wasn't ours anymore. They told him we weren't human enough to live there. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. The defendant, who had been nervously avoiding her gaze, now stared at the table before him, his hands clenched tightly. They made everyone leave, Amara said, her voice quivering. All our neighbors, all the families we grew up with, they had no choice. They promised us money, but we never got anything. We had to move into a small apartment far away. Her small hands loosened their grip on the podium as she glanced around the courtroom. I don't understand why they did it. We didn't do anything wrong. We just wanted to live in our home. The raw pain and sincerity in her words were impossible to ignore. Even those who had doubted her testimony now felt the sting of her experiences. This wasn't just a child's story, it was a window into the systemic injustice that had plagued her community for years. As Amara finished, the judge sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of her story pressing heavily on everyone present. It was clear that this wasn't just another trial. It was a battle for truth, and Amara's courage had become the catalyst for exposing the depths of the defendant's crimes. As Amara finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Her words seemed to linger in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Then, like a match to dry leaves, the room ignited with murmurs, whispers, and gasps. The impact of her story was undeniable, and yet, not everyone was moved with compassion. On one side of the gallery, a group of community members, families who had suffered similar fates, exchanged glances of understanding and sorrow. Many nodded quietly, their faces a mix of anger and vindication, as if Amara had finally given voice to what they had been too afraid to say. But on the other side of the room, whispers of doubt began to circulate. The businessmen's supporters leaned into each other, their hushed tones betraying disbelief and dismissal. How could they let a child testify, one man muttered. She's too young to understand what's really going on. The defense team seized on the rising skepticism. One of the lawyers, a tall, sharp-featured man, stood abruptly. Your Honor, he began, his voice dripping with feigned civility, with all due respect, this is nothing more than hearsay. She's just a child. Who would believe her account of events? The lawyer's words sliced through the room, stirring a fresh wave of whispers. Some heads nodded in agreement, while others turned to Amara with visible pity. The defendant, emboldened by his lawyer's interruption, smirked faintly, leaning back in his chair as though the tide was turning in his favor. Amara's small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of the accusations. Her hands gripped the podium tightly, her knuckles white. But her gaze remained steady, fixed on the judge. The judge, however, wasn't about to let the defense dictate the tone. He raised a hand, silencing the murmurs and cutting off the lawyer mid-sentence. "Sit down, counselor," he said firmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that immediately commanded respect. The lawyer hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to being rebuked, but the judge's stern glare left no room for argument. He sat back down, his lips pressed into a thin line. The judge turned his attention back to Amara. His expression, though stern, had softened slightly. "This courtroom will not dismiss testimony based on age," he said, his voice resonating through the room. "Miss Johnson, please continue. You have the floor." Amara nodded, her confidence bolstered by the judge's support. She lifted her chin, her voice steady as she replied, "Everything I said is true. I heard what they said. I saw what they did." Her unwavering conviction silenced even her harshest skeptics. For a brief moment, even the defendant's supporters seemed unsure of their stance. The weight of Amara's words, her courage, and the clarity of her account made it increasingly difficult to dismiss her as just a child. In that moment, the courtroom became a microcosm of the broader battle against injustice. On one side, those who sought to discredit and silence the truth. On the other, a young girl whose bravery shone as a beacon of hope. And at the center of it all, a judge who now carried the responsibility of ensuring justice prevailed. The tension in the room thickened, but one thing was clear: Amara's testimony had irrevocably shifted the course of the trial. Amara hesitated for a moment before reaching into the pocket of her modest dress. Her small hand trembled slightly as she pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn and creased from being opened and closed too many times. She looked at the judge, her gaze steady despite the weight of what she was about to reveal. "This," she said, holding the note up, "is something my dad wrote before we had to leave our home." Her voice carried a mix of sadness and defiance, and the room, once again, fell into a deep hush. The prosecutor approached the podium, gently taking the note from her hands. He unfolded it carefully, the rustle of paper the only sound in the silent courtroom. The judge watched intently as the prosecutor handed him the document, his expression unreadable. As the judge adjusted his glasses and began to read, his face transformed. The lines of skepticism that had once marked his features now gave way to a mixture of shock and dismay. His brow furrowed deeper with each line, and his fingers gripped the paper tightly, as if holding on to the truth it revealed. "What does it say?" A curious whisper rose from the gallery, but no one dared speak louder. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and looked up, his voice heavy with gravity. "This note details a series of threats made by the defendant's representatives," he said, his words deliberate and slow. "It describes how they tore down fences, called the family names, and made it clear they were no longer welcome, despite owning the property legally." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the energy shifting as the note confirmed everything Amara had said. The defense team scrambled, flipping through their notes, trying to find a way to discredit this new evidence. "It's just a piece of paper," the defense lawyer said, standing abruptly. "How do we know this wasn't fabricated? Written after the fact to strengthen her story?" Amara's head snapped toward the lawyer, her small frame radiating defiance. "It's real," she said firmly. "My dad wrote it when they came to our house. He hid it because he knew they would try to destroy everything." The judge raised his hand, silencing the defense's objections. "Miss Johnson, do you know why your father wrote this note?" he asked, his tone softer now. Amara nodded, her voice trembling slightly but full of determination. He wrote it because he knew they would lie. He told me, one day, someone will listen. Someone will care. Her words struck like a hammer, silencing even the most doubtful. The prosecutor, sensing the power of the moment, stepped forward. Your Honor, the authenticity of this note can be verified. But even without that, it matches the timeline and events corroborated by other witnesses. The judge looked down at the note again, his lips pressed into a thin line. The weight of what he held was palpable. This wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a testament to the suffering, resilience, and courage of a family fighting against a system that had tried to erase them. The defendant, seated at the table, looked visibly rattled. His usual confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a pale, rigid expression. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but it was clear the note had shifted the momentum of the trial. This evidence will be admitted, the judge declared, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. And it will be thoroughly investigated. Amara exhaled softly, relief washing over her face. For the first time, she felt that her father's efforts had not been in vain. This note, a simple piece of paper filled with words of pain and truth, had become a turning point not just in the trial but in the fight for justice her family had long endured. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law, it had become a battleground for truth. And thanks to Amara's courage, the tide had begun to turn. The tension in the courtroom grew heavier as the defense lawyer rose from his chair. His expression was a mix of feigned calm and underlying irritation, but his words carried a sharp edge meant to cut through the momentum Amara had built. Your Honor, he began, adjusting his suit and stepping forward, we must consider the reliability of this testimony. With all due respect, can we truly trust the words of a child? A child who may not fully understand the gravity of this situation? His tone was smooth but laced with subtle condescension, and the unspoken implication hung in the air like a dark cloud. The question rippled through the courtroom, drawing scattered nods from a few of the businessmen's supporters. Others exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the lawyer was taking. The prosecutor immediately stood to object, but before he could speak, the defense lawyer pressed on. And let's not ignore the potential for bias. This is, after all, an emotionally charged case involving a young girl from a community that feels wronged. It's only natural to wonder if her account might be exaggerated or, dare I say, coached. The lawyer's words drew audible gasps from some of the spectators. Several people shifted in their seats, their discomfort evident. A few shook their heads in disbelief, while others stared at the lawyer with thinly veiled disgust. Amara stood silently behind the podium, her small hands gripping its edges. Though her posture remained firm, the flicker of pain in her eyes was unmistakable. She had heard comments like this before, dismissive, degrading, designed to make her feel small. But this time, she wouldn't let them break her. The judge, whose expression had grown increasingly stern, leaned forward slightly. His voice cut through the growing murmurs. Counselor, I would advise you to tread carefully, he warned, his tone icy. Focus on the evidence, not on undermining a witness based on assumptions. The lawyer hesitated for a moment, his composure briefly faltering. But he quickly regrouped, flashing a practiced smile. Of course, Your Honor. I simply wish to highlight the need for caution when considering such emotionally charged testimony. He returned to his seat, but the damage was already done, both to his argument and to the atmosphere in the room. Amara took a deep breath, her young face set with determination. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. I'm not lying, she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. I'm telling the truth because I saw it happen. My dad told me to always tell the truth, even if people don't want to hear it. Her statement hung in the air, silencing even the whispers of the businessmen's supporters. The raw honesty in her voice was impossible to dismiss. The prosecutor, emboldened by her courage, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, this child has shown more integrity in her few years than many adults in this room. Her testimony aligns with evidence we've already presented, and it speaks to a much larger truth about the injustices her family and community have endured. The judge nodded, his stern gaze sweeping across the courtroom. This court will not tolerate baseless insinuations, he said firmly, directing his words at the defense team. Miss Johnson's testimony will be treated with the respect it deserves. The lawyer for the defense sat stiffly, his earlier confidence now replaced with visible unease. Meanwhile, Amara's bravery began to shift the energy in the room. Even those who had doubted her now found themselves questioning their own biases. By standing firm against the attempts to discredit her, Amara had not only held her ground but also forced the courtroom to confront an uncomfortable truth: the prejudice that sought to silence her was the very reason her testimony mattered so much. The courtroom's tension had not abated when the prosecutor announced the presentation of new evidence. The revelation was swift and decisive, a video provided by an anonymous witness that could alter the course of the trial. The room collectively leaned forward, the low hum of murmurs falling silent as the prosecutor adjusted a laptop connected to the courtroom's monitor. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, his voice steady, this video, submitted anonymously by a former associate of the defendant, provides further insight into his actions and motivations. It will prove beyond doubt that the defendant's actions were not only illegal but deeply rooted in prejudice. The judge nodded, signaling the prosecutor to proceed. As the video began to play, the screen filled with grainy but clear footage. It showed the defendant standing in the middle of a neighborhood recognizable from earlier testimonies, rows of modest homes with neatly kept yards. His posture was casual, but his words were anything but. They don't belong here, the defendant's voice rang out, sharp and cutting. These people are unfit to live on this land. They don't even deserve it. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The defendant's face on the screen was unmistakable, and his tone carried an air of absolute certainty. The camera caught him gesturing dismissively toward the homes, his disdain palpable. We'll clear them out, one way or another. Trust me, they'll fold. The video continued, capturing his interaction with a group of men, his associates. They laughed as he described the tactics they would use to pressure the families into leaving. They're too weak to fight back, he said with a smirk. And if they try, we'll make sure they regret it. The prosecutor paused the video, allowing the weight of what had just been shown to settle over the courtroom. The silence was deafening, broken only by the shuffle of papers from the defense table as they frantically sought a way to respond. Amara, sitting quietly next to her legal guardian, looked up at the screen. Her face reflected a mixture of vindication and sadness. Everything she and her family had endured was now laid bare for the world to see. The defendant's words weren't just cruel, they were calculated, methodical, and entirely devoid of humanity. The judge's expression darkened, his fingers laced together as he leaned forward. Counselor, he said, addressing the defense lawyer, do you have any explanation for this? The lawyer stood, his face pale. Your Honor, he stammered, we were not made aware of this footage before today. We cannot confirm its authenticity. The prosecutor didn't miss a beat. Your Honor, the video has been verified by independent experts. The timestamp aligns perfectly with the dates provided by multiple witnesses, including Miss Johnson. There is no doubt that the defendant's words and actions were deliberate. The defendant, who had remained mostly silent throughout the trial, now looked visibly shaken. His composure cracked as he leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously. His attempts to remain stoic had been shattered by the undeniable truth on the screen. The audience, which had been divided at the trial's outset, now leaned firmly toward outrage. People whispered angrily among themselves, their disapproval of the defendant's behavior growing louder with each passing moment. This video, the prosecutor continued, his voice rising slightly, proves what this court has suspected all along. The defendant's actions were not only illegal but motivated by deep-seated prejudice against an entire community. The judge nodded solemnly, his tone firm as he spoke. This court will not tolerate such behavior, nor the harm it has caused to innocent families. The evidence presented today will be considered with the utmost seriousness. As the video replayed for the jurors, it became clear that this was the turning point. The defendant's cruel words and deliberate actions had been exposed for all to see. His confidence had crumbled, and his lawyer's protests rang hollow in the face of such damning evidence. For Amara and her community, this was more than a legal victory, it was the beginning of justice, a chance to reclaim their dignity and hold those who sought to oppress them accountable. The truth, finally revealed, had become their most powerful weapon. The judge sat in silence for a long moment, his hands folded tightly on the bench in front of him. His once skeptical eyes now carried a mixture of gravity and respect as they lingered on Amara, seated quietly next to her legal guardian. Her bravery in the mounting evidence had forced a profound shift in the way he viewed this case, and, perhaps, himself. When the trial began, the judge had been skeptical, dismissing Amara's presence as a strategic ploy by the prosecution. He had doubted the weight of her testimony, assuming that a young girl couldn't possibly influence such a complex case. Now, as the damning evidence piled up, her father's note, the shocking video footage, and her unshakable words, he realized how deeply wrong he had been. Clearing his throat, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed firmly on Amara. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice carrying a tone that was both measured and sincere, "I must admit, when you first stood at that podium, I wasn't sure what to expect. But your courage, your honesty, and your determination have done more for this court today than I could have anticipated." His words sent a ripple through the room, and many spectators exchanged surprised glances. The judge, known for his unyielding demeanor, rarely offered such personal acknowledgments. Yet, it was clear that Amara had pierced through even his hardened exterior. Turning his focus back to the courtroom as a whole, the judge addressed everyone present. "This case is not just about land or property," he said, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "It is about power, prejudice, and the devastating effects of unchecked cruelty. The evidence we have seen and heard today has exposed more than one man's wrongdoing. It has shown us how systemic injustice thrives when we allow ourselves to ignore the suffering of others." The defendant squirmed in his chair, his once confident posture now reduced to a hunched, defensive slouch. His lawyer whispered something to him, but the businessman didn't respond. He seemed to sense the tide had fully turned against him. The judge's tone sharpened as he continued. This young girl, who had every reason to stay silent, chose to speak up. She brought to light the truth of what was done to her family and her community. It is a truth that cannot and will not be ignored by this court. Amara felt her guardian squeeze her shoulder gently, a silent gesture of support as the weight of the moment settled on her. She glanced around the room, seeing faces of strangers who now looked at her with admiration instead of doubt. Even some of the businessmen's supporters seemed visibly uneasy, their earlier smugness replaced with discomfort. The actions of the defendant, the judge declared, his voice rising slightly, are a stark reminder of what happens when we let greed and hatred dictate our decisions. But this case also reminds us of the power of truth, no matter how small the voice that carries it. For the first time since the trial began, the judge allowed a faint smile to touch his lips as he looked back at Amara. "Thank you, Miss Johnson, for reminding this court, and all of us, of what courage truly looks like." The courtroom fell into a reverent silence, the weight of the judge's words settling over everyone present. Amara blinked back tears, her small hands gripping her guardian's arm for reassurance. She hadn't just told her story, she had changed the narrative of the trial and, in doing so, had inspired others to see the humanity in her struggle. The defendant, who had remained silent until now, muttered something under his breath, his face pale and defeated. But his words went unnoticed. All eyes were on Amara, the young girl whose truth had dismantled an empire of lies. The final day of the trial dawned with a sense of anticipation. The courtroom was packed once again, every seat taken and every corner filled with spectators and reporters eager to hear the verdict. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only comes when justice hangs in the balance. At the center of it all sat Amara, her small frame seemingly dwarfed by the weight of what her courage had set in motion. The judge, now carrying a far more solemn expression than when the trial began, called the court to order. His gavel struck once, silencing the murmur of voices. The defendant, pale and visibly drained, sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor reduced to a hollow shell. His lawyers avoided his gaze, knowing the tide had turned irreversibly. The verdict was announced swiftly. Guilty on all charges, the foreman declared, his voice ringing clear and final. The room erupted into a mix of gasps, cheers, and sobs of relief. The defendant's face contorted with disbelief as the reality of his downfall began to sink in. The judge's voice cut through the noise. This court orders the defendant's company to fully compensate all families affected by his actions. Additionally, the defendant will face the maximum sentence allowed by law. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. Let this serve as a reminder that no one, regardless of their wealth or status, is above the law. Tears welled in Amara's eyes as her guardian hugged her tightly. Around the courtroom, other families, those who had suffered the same injustices, clutched one another in shared relief. The weight of years of pain and humiliation began to lift, replaced by a glimmer of hope for the future. But the story didn't end there. In the days that followed, Amara's testimony in the trial's outcome spread like wildfire. News outlets across the country covered the case, praising the young girl whose courage had brought down a powerful businessman. Headlines declared her a symbol of truth and a beacon of justice. Interviews flooded in, but Amara's focus remained on her family and her community. Her story inspired countless others to speak out against injustices they had endured. Community leaders began organizing discussions and initiatives to address systemic racism and inequality. Amara herself was invited to schools and community events, where she shared her experience and encouraged others to stand up for what was right, no matter how small their voice might seem. The courtroom, once a place of intimidation and fear, became a space of redemption and hope. The families who had lost their homes began rebuilding, empowered by the compensation they received and the knowledge that justice had finally been served. For Amara, life changed in many ways, but her humility remained. "I just told the truth," she said in an interview, her words resonating with a power that belied her young age. Sometimes that's all it takes to make a difference. The defendant's fall became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of greed and prejudice. His name, once associated with power and influence, was now a symbol of disgrace. As the trial faded into history, its legacy endured. Amara's bravery and the case's outcome served as a beacon of hope, reminding people everywhere that even the smallest voice could bring about monumental change. If you found Amara's story inspiring, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from, and how did her journey impact you? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more stories that prove the power of truth and courage.